A white officer with the NYPD pulls over a black woman driving a luxury car, suspecting she couldn't possibly own it. But he has no idea. He just made a grave mistake. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the Upper West Side, where quiet streets and elegant brownstones lined the sidewalks. Everything seemed orderly, until a sleek black sports car moved through, drawing unwanted attention. Officer Daniel Carter switched on his lights. The car slowed to a stop. Stepping out, Daniel adjusted his belt, scanning the vehicle. The driver's door opened. A woman emerged, poised and composed. No hesitation, no nervous glances. She met his gaze, calm and steady. Daniel expected explanations, unease, something familiar. Instead, she simply waited. Something about her presence unsettled him. This wasn't going to be routine. The Upper West Side basked under the late afternoon sun. Wide streets, gated townhouses, polished luxury sedans parked in perfect rows. Everything about this neighborhood spoke of exclusivity and predictability. That's why Officer Daniel Carter noticed the black sports car the moment it passed. It wasn't just the car, it was the driver. A black woman, alone, effortless. Something about it didn't sit right. Did she live here? Was she visiting? Or was it something else? Daniel exhaled sharply, his instincts kicking in. He had worked these streets long enough to know who belonged and who didn't. Flashing lights, a sharp siren chirp. The black car slowed, gliding to a stop. Daniel stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he approached. He expected hesitation, uncertainty. Instead, the driver's door swung open, and Maya Williams stepped out, composed and steady. She didn't rush, didn't fumble for her ID, didn't ask why she was being stopped. She simply looked at him. Daniel's jaw clenched. He was in control here. He was the one asking the questions. Then why did it suddenly feel like she was the one assessing him? The patrol car's red and blue lights flashed against the dark sheen of the sports car. Officer Daniel Carter approached, his boots pressing into the pavement with measured force. He wasn't in a rush. He wanted to make an impression. His knuckles rapped against the tinted window, harder than necessary. The sound cracked through the air, demanding attention. A moment later, the glass lowered. Maya Williams looked up at him. Her face was unreadable. No nervous shifting. No fumbling for paperwork. Just calm, deliberate stillness. Daniel hated it. He leaned in slightly. "Nice car. You sure it's yours?" It was the kind of line that usually rattled people. He had used it before. Watched drivers scramble to justify themselves, to prove their innocence before even being accused. But Maya didn't flinch. She blinked once, slowly, before reaching for her glove compartment. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Daniel's fingers twitched near his holster. His instincts screamed this wasn't right. She retrieved a black leather wallet, flipping it open and handing over her license and registration. "I'm sure, but feel free to check." Daniel took the documents without looking at them right away. Instead, he studied her. Expensive watch, immaculate nails, a presence that didn't shrink under his gaze. He glanced at the registration, his brow tightening. The name matched. The car wasn't stolen. Still, he wasn't done. "You from around here?" His voice was casual, but his tone carried an unspoken message. Maya exhaled lightly, as if she had seen this play out before. "I live just down the street." Daniel's eyes flicked toward the pristine houses lining the block. "That's so. Don't see too many." He caught himself, but the words were already there. He smirked, as if to downplay it. "I mean, I wasn't aware the neighborhood had changed much." Maya's expression didn't shift, but there was something knowing in the way she tilted her head. Daniel felt it, the shift in control. He doubled down. "Pop the trunk." Maya arched a brow. "For what reason?" Daniel's smirk thinned. He didn't like being questioned. I just want to take a look. Do you have probable cause? Her voice was smooth, precise. Daniel squared his shoulders. I don't need probable cause for a routine check. You do. Silence stretched between them. Daniel felt heat creep up the back of his neck. She was too damn composed, too certain, like she knew something he didn't. His grip on control was slipping. He glanced over his shoulder and gestured toward his radio. I think I'll run your name real quick. Just standard procedure. Maya didn't move. Do what you need to do. There was no edge in her voice, no frustration, just permission, and that irritated him more than anything. He turned, pressing his radio. Dispatch, I need a... Daniel. The voice wasn't Maya's. A second patrol car had pulled up and Officer Ryan Keller stepped out. Younger, still fresh in the force, but not stupid. Keller's gaze flicked between Daniel and Maya. Everything good here? Daniel forced a nod. But something in Keller's eyes told him he wasn't buying it. Maya exhaled through her nose. Apparently, my license and registration weren't enough. Keller hesitated. He had seen this before. Stops that went too far. Stops that weren't about actual infractions, but about power. Daniel read the doubt on his face. His jaw clenched. Just making sure everything checks out, that's all, Daniel muttered. You can never be too careful. Maya finally tilted her head. Not in submission, but in something dangerously close to amusement. Like she was waiting to see how far he'd push it. Daniel turned back to Keller. Go ahead and run her info. I'll verify it myself. Keller didn't move right away. Daniel's patience thinned. Ryan. Now. Keller sighed and reached for his radio. Daniel turned back to Maya, crossing his arms. He wasn't letting her go that easily. Where do you work? The question was laced with something unspoken. Maya studied him, then offered a small smile. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Daniel's irritation boiled just beneath the surface. Try me. Maya's expression remained unreadable. Benson and Knight, Main Street. Daniel frowned. That was one of the most well-known law firms in the city. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind. It didn't add up. But before he could press further, Keller straightened, lowering his radio. She's clean. Daniel knew it before the words left Keller's mouth. No warrants, no record, no outstanding tickets. Nothing. For a split second, he considered letting her go. But then Maya spoke. You were about to call my workplace, weren't you? Daniel stiffened. She let a pause linger, then said evenly, Go ahead. His fingers tightened around the radio, then relaxed. Something about her tone made him hesitate. Why wasn't she fighting back? Why wasn't she flustered? Daniel's gut twisted. She wasn't worried. She should be. But deep down, he felt something else. He was the one who should be worried. Officer Daniel Carter stood rigid, feeling the weight of the afternoon sun pressing on the back of his neck. He handed Maya Williams her document slowly, reluctantly, as if surrendering something precious. Every instinct told him to keep her there, to prove his authority, but every rational thought whispered he had no legitimate cause. You can go, he finally said, his voice sharp, but with an edge of reluctant defeat. For now. Maya calmly retrieved her documents, sliding them back into her wallet without urgency, eyes never leaving his face. I appreciate that, officer. Daniel bristled. Her serenity was maddening. People didn't react this way to him. They argued, begged, explained nervously, but not her. Why wasn't she afraid? He watched closely, searching her expression for fear or discomfort, but found none. I'll be watching you, Daniel said suddenly, words slipping out harsher than intended. Don't think you've gotten away with something. People like you don't just stroll through neighborhoods like this without raising eyebrows. Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing, not in anger but curiosity, as if examining something puzzling or faintly amusing. A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed her lips. "People like me," she repeated softly, letting the implication hover between them. "Well, Officer Carter, just remember, I'll be watching you too." He opened his mouth to respond, but she had already turned away. Maya gracefully entered her car, the door closing firmly behind her. The engine hummed back to life, its smooth, quiet power contrasting sharply with Daniel's internal turmoil. As Maya drove away, Daniel remained rooted to the pavement, fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't shake the feeling of being humiliated, even though nothing tangible had happened. She hadn't yelled, hadn't argued, yet her calmness was an insult greater than any harsh words. His pride ached as he watched her car disappear around the corner. Beside him, Officer Ryan Keller cleared his throat. Daniel turned, eyes narrowed. "Is there a problem, Ryan?" Keller hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Did you really need to keep her so long? I mean, she was clean." Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. "You questioning my judgment now?" "No, but nothing," Daniel snapped, voice lowered to an icy warning. "She didn't belong here. Simple as that." Keller shifted his weight, eyes uncertain. Daniel felt a flush of irritation rise. Even his partner questioned him now? He glanced around, noticing for the first time that a few pedestrians had paused, watching from across the street, whispering amongst themselves. A woman walking her dog shook her head in silent disapproval. An older man paused, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Daniel felt exposed, frustration building like a slow fire within him. They didn't understand. None of them had his experience, his authority. None of them knew what it took to keep a neighborhood safe. But their judgmental gazes burned hotter than he cared to admit. He turned away abruptly, climbing back into his patrol car and shutting the door harder than necessary. The silence within the vehicle was deafening, suffocating. He stared blankly at the dashboard, fingers gripping the steering wheel, knuckles pale with tension. For a brief moment he wondered if perhaps he'd pushed too far, crossed an invisible line. "No," he muttered to himself, shaking off the doubt. "I did my job." Yet, as he pulled away from the curb, something unsettling lingered in the pit of his stomach, an unease he couldn't shake, a feeling he rarely experienced. The confidence he had wielded moments earlier was now diluted by uncertainty. Back at the precinct, Daniel parked the cruiser and stepped inside, immediately sensing a shift in atmosphere. Conversations hushed abruptly as he passed. Colleagues turned their heads away, avoiding eye contact. The familiar buzz of camaraderie suddenly seemed distant, almost foreign. His footsteps echoed through the hallway louder than usual, amplifying his discomfort. He sank into the chair at his desk, fingers drumming anxiously on the surface. Daniel tried to push the earlier incident from his mind, but Maya's composed face and calm words lingered stubbornly, haunting him. He felt trapped, as though he'd started something he couldn't control. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It felt different. He couldn't put a name to the unease gnawing at him. His thoughts shattered as his phone vibrated sharply against the wooden desktop. Daniel glanced down, noticing Captain Lee's direct line flashing on the screen. His heart skipped a beat, a sudden wave of dread tightening his chest. Swallowing hard, he picked up the phone. "Carter speaking." "Carter, my office, now." Captain Lee's voice was crisp, leaving no room for questions or hesitation. The call disconnected without another word, leaving Daniel holding the silent receiver for a beat too long, fingers trembling slightly. Why the urgency? Could someone have reported him already? Impossible. But Lee's tone told him something was seriously wrong, something that couldn't wait. He stood up, forcing himself to remain composed, straightening his uniform instinctively. As he walked toward the captain's office, the precinct seemed quieter than usual. Eyes followed him discreetly, curious, yet cautious. The tension in the air was palpable, pressing down on him with every step. Approaching the captain's door, Daniel paused momentarily, hand hovering just above the handle. The brief hesitation felt unnatural, almost weak. Angrily dismissing the feeling, he twisted the knob, entering the office. Captain Marcus Lee stood near the window, his back to Daniel, his broad shoulders squared with tension. A framed photo sat on Lee's desk, angled slightly toward Daniel. He caught a fleeting glance. Captain Lee, smiling warmly alongside a familiar face. Maya Williams. Daniel's breath caught sharply, his pulse quickening. An icy chill crept up his spine. His earlier confidence crumbled instantly, replaced by a heavy dread he couldn't ignore. Captain Lee turned slowly from the window, eyes locked firmly onto Daniel's face. "Close the door behind you, Carter." Daniel obeyed, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. "Take a seat," Lee said, voice deceptively calm. Daniel sank slowly into the chair opposite, mind racing with questions, excuses, panic. Captain Lee's expression hardened, his voice colder than Daniel had ever heard it. "We need to talk about your conduct today." Daniel opened his mouth, searching desperately for words, but nothing came. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that his troubles were just beginning. Daniel Carter exhaled, feeling the tension seep out from between his clenched teeth. Reluctantly, he handed Maya Williams her documents, irritation radiating through every stiff gesture. "You can go," he said curtly. Then he paused, eyes narrowing, unable to hold back one last warning. "But I'll be watching you. Don't think you can just drive around this neighborhood unnoticed." Maya's expression hardly changed. Instead, she fixed him with a quiet, defiant gaze, a smile that was subtle, faintly amused. "You do that, Officer Carter. Just don't be surprised when you find out who else is watching." He tensed, taken aback by her calm audacity. He had the badge, yet somehow, she had made it feel meaningless. Maya gracefully returned to her car, sliding in smoothly, as though their exchange meant nothing to her. He watched as she drove away, the sports car disappearing around the next corner, leaving only a silent, unanswered challenge behind. Officer Keller cleared his throat softly, pulling Daniel back into reality. "What?" Daniel snapped, turning sharply toward him. Keller hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "Did we really need to hold her so long?" She was clean. Daniel's eyes narrowed sharply. "Questioning me now, Ryan?" "No, it's just—" "She did nothing wrong," Keller said cautiously. Daniel scowled, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "She didn't belong here. We did our job." Keller shifted uneasily, not convinced. "Sure, whatever you say." A few pedestrians, drawn by the flashing lights, had paused, observing silently. A man watering his lawn watched them suspiciously. His elderly neighbor stopped trimming hedges, casting Daniel a disapproving glance. Daniel could feel the scrutiny, the judgment from ordinary people who couldn't possibly understand the pressures of his job. Embarrassment twisted into anger, making him feel exposed, humiliated. He turned abruptly, returning to his patrol car, without another word, slamming the door harder than intended. Keller watched silently before returning to his vehicle, shaking his head slightly as he drove away. Sitting alone in the patrol car, Daniel stared straight ahead. Maya's composed face lingered stubbornly in his mind. She hadn't behaved the way he expected. She hadn't folded, hadn't shown the slightest fear. He could still hear her words echoing clearly, calmly challenging him. Something felt off. Something deep inside told him this encounter was far from over. Minutes passed. He tried to shake the encounter from his mind, but Maya's face persisted. Finally, his radio crackled sharply, startling him back to attention. "Officer Carter, report immediately to Captain Lee's office." Daniel's pulse quickened at the urgency in Dispatch's voice. He reached for the radio, his hand unsteady. "Roger that, on my way." The drive back to the precinct felt longer than usual, as if every streetlight and intersection conspired to delay him, building dread with every passing block. When he finally parked and stepped into the precinct, the normally friendly faces of fellow officers turned distant, avoiding eye contact as he walked past. Daniel felt the chill of suspicion pressing against him from all sides. Approaching Captain Marcus Lee's office, his steps slowed. He knocked lightly and heard a crisp, "Come in," from behind the door. Daniel entered slowly. Captain Lee stood quietly, staring out the window. The silence lingered uncomfortably. "Sit down, Carter," Lee commanded firmly, without turning around. Daniel sat stiffly, shifting nervously under the captain's measured silence. Lee turned, his gaze piercing through Daniel as he moved toward the computer on his desk. "Explain what happened today," Lee said calmly, clicking the mouse. Daniel glanced up at the screen. Immediately, his stomach sank. A video played. His voice echoed clearly. "Nice car. You sure it's yours?" His own smug tone cut sharply through the room. The entire humiliating exchange unfolded clearly, captured from Maya's dashboard camera. Daniel felt his breath catch, his chest tightening painfully. The footage played relentlessly, each word, each unnecessary accusation exposing his prejudice in stark detail. When the video ended, silence hung heavy between them. Daniel searched frantically for words, explanations, justifications, something to ease the disappointment he saw plainly in Lee's expression. Captain, I was doing a routine," Daniel began. Lee raised his hand sharply, cutting him off. "Routine? What I see here isn't routine. It's harassment, plain and simple." Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly. "Captain, I had reason to believe—" "You had reason to suspect her because she's black and driving an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood," Lee interrupted coldly, his voice quieter but filled with authority. "That's profiling, Carter, and it doesn't belong in this department." Daniel lowered his eyes, the reality of his actions finally breaking through his defenses. Silence stretched unbearably, Lee allowing the weight of Daniel's misconduct to press down on him. Lee's voice softened, but remained firm. "You made a huge mistake today, Carter." Daniel met Lee's gaze, humiliation evident in his posture. "Captain, I never meant—" "Didn't you?" Lee's tone sharpened again, his eyes steady, unforgiving. "Would you have stopped her if she looked like me?" Daniel hesitated, unable to answer. The question burned painfully, exposing him completely. Lee reached forward, adjusting the framed photo of Maya on his desk, facing it squarely toward Daniel. The image was unmistakable. Captain Lee smiling warmly, arm wrapped around Maya Williams. Daniel stared in disbelief, realization striking like lightning. The room seemed to tilt. The breath caught sharply in his chest. Lee leaned forward, voice quiet yet ice cold. "She's my wife, Carter." Daniel's heart pounded in panic, dread flooding his senses. He'd stepped over a line he didn't even know existed until this moment. Every ounce of arrogance drained from his body, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. Lee stood, signaling clearly the conversation was ending. "From now on, consider every step you take carefully, Officer Carter. You'll be watched closely. This isn't a warning, it's a promise." Daniel rose shakily, understanding the full gravity of Lee's words. He left the office silently, his head low, heart heavy. The whispers of colleagues followed him down the hall, eyes avoiding his gaze, distancing themselves from his disgrace. The weight of the consequences settled fully upon him now, undeniable and suffocating. Daniel knew nothing would ever be the same again. Officer Daniel Carter sat alone in the precinct break room, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead accentuating the cold emptiness around him. Conversations paused abruptly whenever he entered, and familiar faces now turned away, unwilling to meet his gaze. He felt the stark distance, like he'd become a stranger in his own precinct. His phone vibrated suddenly, breaking his thoughts. The message was brief, brutal, from his wife. "I've moved out. Don't contact me again." Daniel's fingers went slack, the phone dropping onto the table with a dull clatter. He stared blankly ahead, eyes fixed on the bold NYPD motto displayed prominently on the wall. To serve and protect. Each word seemed to mock him now, highlighting his own failure. He had believed authority meant absolute power. Yet, now he understood differently. Justice was more powerful, and it had caught up with him at last. Captain Marcus Lee's chilling promise echoed relentlessly in his ears. "I'll be watching you." Justice wasn't merely a slogan. It required accountability. Those who abused power would always face consequences. Do you believe Carter deserved this outcome? Should he be forgiven? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you value social justice and human rights stories, please subscribe for more content.